The gavel fell like a death sentence on dignity itself. In the makeshift courthouse of Bitter Creek, where justice wore the mask of entertainment, Celia Moreno stood before a crowd hungry for her humiliation. The judge's laughter echoed off wooden walls as he gestured toward the line of shackled men like livestock at auction. "Pick anyone," he mocked, his words dripping with the poison of assumed superiority. But when her finger pointed toward the man in heaviest chains, the one they called a killer, silence swallowed the room whole. In that moment, she had chosen not just a man, but a rebellion that would burn through their certainty like wildfire through dry grass. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Bitter Creek's courthouse, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards where justice was dispensed with the same casual brutality as Saturday night poker games. Celia Moreno stood in the center of the room, her mixed heritage written in the copper of her skin and the defiant tilt of her chin, while 24 pairs of eyes measured her worth like cattle at market. The deportation order crumpled in Judge Morrison's meaty fist, carried the weight of exile, of being cast into a wilderness that would swallow her whole, but the alternative he offered tasted even more bitter on her tongue. Around her, the townspeople leaned forward in their seats, their faces bright with the anticipation of witnessing another soul's degradation, their whispers creating a symphony of cruelty that filled the spaces between the judge's words. She could smell their excitement, sharp and metallic like blood on a butcher's apron, mixing with the stale tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies that made the courthouse feel more like a tomb than a temple of justice. The weight of their stares pressed against her shoulders, each gaze a small violence that sought to strip away whatever dignity she had managed to preserve through 26 years of existing between worlds that claimed her but never truly accepted her. The line of prisoners stretched along the far wall like a gallery of broken dreams, each man shackled and defeated in his own particular way, their crimes ranging from theft to murder, their faces bearing the marks of hard living and harder choices. Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the room with theatrical pleasure as he explained the terms of her salvation, his words painting marriage as both mercy and mockery, a legal fiction that would keep her from deportation while providing entertainment for the assembled crowd. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a land built on the promise of freedom, she was being forced to choose bondage as her only path to survival. The chains of matrimony offered as liberation from the chains of exile. Behind the judge, the American flag hung limp and faded, its stars and stripes bearing witness to this perversion of justice, this reduction of human dignity to a parlor game for the amusement of those who had never known what it meant to stand on the margins of belonging. She felt the familiar burn of rage in her chest, the same fire that had sustained her through years of sideways glances and whispered slurs. But now it was mixed with something else, something that felt dangerously close to despair. The courthouse walls seemed to close in around her, the weight of expectation and humiliation pressing down like a physical force, while the judge's laughter echoed off the rafters like the cawing of carrion birds circling fresh death. Her eyes moved along the line of men, taking in their various states of defeat and resignation, seeing in their faces the reflection of her own trapped circumstances, the way injustice had cornered them all in this moment of forced theatre. There was the horse thief with his nervous twitch, the drunk who couldn't meet anyone's gaze, the card cheat whose fingers still moved restlessly even in chains. Each one a story of choices made and consequences faced in a world that offered few second chances. The crowd's murmur grew louder as they waited for her selection, their voices creating a buzz of anticipation that made her skin crawl, their entertainment built on the foundation of her humiliation and these men's degradation. She could feel the judge's impatience growing, his theatrical generosity beginning to sour as she took longer than expected to choose her fate, his fingers drumming against the makeshift bench in a rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. The morning light shifted, casting new shadows across the room, and in those shadows she saw the truth of what this moment represented. Not justice, but its complete absence. Not mercy, but its cruel parody. The weight of her mother's indigenous blood and her father's Spanish heritage seemed to press against her ribs, reminding her of all the ways she had never quite belonged anywhere, all the doors that had been closed to her simply because of what she was, rather than who she was. At the far end of the line, almost hidden in the shadows cast by the courthouse's eastern wall, stood a man whose presence seemed to command the space around him despite his chains, his silence more powerful than the nervous chatter of the other prisoners. Jack Rawlins wore his shackles like a king might wear a crown, with a dignity that the iron couldn't diminish, his dark hair falling across a face that bore the marks of recent violence but hadn't been broken by it. The charges against him hung in the air like smoke. Murder, they said, the killing of a prominent rancher in a dispute over water rights, but something in his bearing suggested a story more complex than the simple narrative the town had constructed around his guilt. His eyes, when they briefly met hers across the crowded room, held depths that spoke of intelligence and pain in equal measure, a combination that made her chest tighten with recognition of a kindred spirit trapped in circumstances beyond his control. The crowd's attention seemed to slide past him, as if his very presence made them uncomfortable, as if the possibility of his innocence was too dangerous to contemplate in a town that had already decided his fate. She noticed how the other prisoners gave him space, not from fear, but from respect, the way men acknowledge someone who has maintained his honor even in the face of dishonor, someone who has refused to be diminished by the diminishment of others. The judge's voice cut through her contemplation like a blade through silk, his words sharp with impatience and dark with the promise of consequences if she continued to delay the spectacle he had orchestrated for the crowd's pleasure. "Time's wasting, girl," he growled, his earlier theatrical joviality giving way to something harder and more threatening, the mask of benevolence slipping to reveal the cruelty beneath. The townspeople shifted in their seats, their anticipation curdling into irritation as the entertainment they had come to witness stretched beyond their attention spans, their faces showing the particular ugliness of people denied their expected amusement. She could feel the moment crystallizing around her, the weight of choice pressing down like a physical force, the knowledge that whatever decision she made would ripple outward through her life in ways she couldn't predict or control. The air in the courthouse felt thick and oppressive, heavy with the breath of too many people and the weight of too much injustice, making each inhalation feel like an effort, each heartbeat like a countdown to an irreversible moment. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, not from fear, but from the effort of containing the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her, the rage and despair and desperate hope all warring for dominance in her chest. In the silence that stretched between the judge's demand and her response, she could hear the tick of the courthouse clock, marking time like a metronome counting down to destiny, each second bringing her closer to a choice that would define not just her immediate future, but the very essence of who she was and who she might become. The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, tension crackling through the courthouse air as Celia's finger rose slowly, deliberately, cutting through the space between her and the line of shackled men with the precision of a blade finding its mark. The crowd held its collective breath, their faces turned toward her with the hungry attention of spectators at a hanging, waiting to see which broken soul she would claim as her salvation and her burden. Her finger moved past the obvious choices, the men who shuffled and avoided eye contact, the ones who seemed grateful for any chance at redemption, their desperation written in the slump of their shoulders and the hope flickering in their eyes like dying candles. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second, thick with anticipation and the particular cruelty of people who had gathered to witness another's humiliation, their entertainment built on the foundation of forced choices and manufactured desperation. Judge Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his face flushed with the pleasure of orchestrating this theater of degradation, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a man who believed he held absolute power over the fates of those who stood before him. The morning light continued its slow journey across the courthouse floor, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits bearing witness to this perversion of justice, this reduction of human dignity, to a game played for the amusement of those who had never known what it meant to stand powerless before the machinery of law. When her finger finally stopped, pointing directly at Jack Rawlins in his heavy chains, the silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself, as if the very air had been sucked from the room by the audacity of her choice. The crowd's collective gasp came a heartbeat later, a sound like wind rushing through a canyon, followed immediately by an explosion of whispers and exclamations that filled the courthouse with the buzz of shocked disbelief. Judge Morrison's face went through a series of transformations, from surprise to anger to something that looked almost like fear, as if her choice had upset some carefully constructed balance he had been maintaining through the careful orchestration of this morning's proceedings. The other prisoners turned to look at Jack with expressions ranging from admiration to pity, understanding better than anyone in the room what it meant to be chosen when you were the most dangerous option, the one everyone expected to be left until last, if chosen at all. Jack himself remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Celia with an intensity that seemed to cut through the chaos around them, his face revealing nothing of what he thought about being selected by this woman who had just marked herself as either the bravest or most foolish person in Bitter Creek. The weight of chains around his wrists and ankles seemed to grow heavier in that moment, not from the iron itself, but from the sudden responsibility of being chosen, of becoming someone's hope when he had been marked by the town as someone's doom. The judge's recovery was swift but incomplete, his theatrical composure reasserting itself like a mask hastily donned, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the depth of his surprise at this unexpected turn in his carefully scripted drama. "The killer," he managed to say, his words carrying a mixture of disbelief and dark amusement, as if he couldn't quite believe someone would willingly tie their fate to a man condemned for murder. The crowd's murmur grew louder, their voices creating a symphony of shock and speculation, some laughing at what they perceived as the foolishness of her choice, others whispering about the madness that must have driven her to select the most dangerous man in the room. Celia stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, her chin raised in defiance, her dark eyes never leaving Jack's face, as if she were trying to communicate something across the space between them that words couldn't convey. The morning sun had shifted again, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the courthouse floor, and in those shifting patterns she saw a reflection of the choice she had just made, the way light and darkness could exist in the same space. The way truth and perception could be separated by nothing more than the angle from which you chose to look. Her heart hammered against her ribs, with a rhythm that seemed to echo the sound of Jack's chains as he shifted slightly, the first movement he had made since she had pointed in his direction, a subtle acknowledgement that passed between them like a secret shared in a room full of strangers. The practical implications of her choice began to settle over the room, like dust after an explosion, the reality of what she had done sinking into the consciousness of everyone present with varying degrees of horror and fascination. Judge Morrison's theatrical pleasure was now mixed with something that looked suspiciously like concern, as if he had suddenly realized that his game might have consequences he hadn't anticipated, that the entertainment he had orchestrated might spiral beyond his control. The townspeople's whispers grew more urgent, their voices carrying speculation about her motives, her sanity, her understanding of what she had just committed herself to, their entertainment now tinged with the uncomfortable realization that they were witnessing something that went beyond their expectations of how this morning should unfold. Behind the judge, The court clerk shuffled through papers with nervous efficiency, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the documents that would legally bind these two unlikely souls together, his face pale with the understanding that he was about to officiate a union that defied every expectation of sense and safety. The other prisoners watched with expressions that ranged from admiration to bewilderment, some nodding with approval at her courage, others shaking their heads at what they perceived as her foolishness, all of them understanding that they had just witnessed something that would be talked about in Bitter Creek for years to come. The weight of history seemed to press down on the moment, the sense that this choice would ripple outward through time in ways that none of them could predict or control, changing not just the lives of the two people at its center, but the very fabric of the community that had gathered to witness it. Jack's voice, when he finally spoke, cut through the chaos like a knife through silk, his words quiet but carrying clearly across the courthouse in the sudden hush that fell when people realized the condemned man was about to speak. "Ma'am," he said simply, his tone carrying a weight of respect that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including Celia herself, who had expected anger or resentment, or at least confusion at being chosen by a stranger for reasons she hadn't explained. His eyes held hers across the space between them, and in that gaze she saw something that made her chest tighten with recognition, a depth of understanding that suggested he knew exactly why she had chosen him, that he had seen in her the same thing she had seen in him. The crowd's murmur died away to nothing as people strained to hear what else he might say, their faces bright with curiosity about this unexpected development in their morning's entertainment, their attention focused on the man they had come to see condemned, but who was now speaking with a dignity that made some of them shift uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Morrison's face had gone through another series of transformations, settling finally into an expression of grim determination, as if he had decided to push forward with the proceedings despite the unexpected turn they had taken. His theatrical pleasure now replaced by something that looked more like duty reluctantly performed. The morning light continued its journey across the courthouse floor, and in its movement, Celia saw a reflection of the choice she had made. The way a single decision could change the direction of everything that followed. The way courage and foolishness could look identical until time revealed which one had been chosen. The sound of chains moving as Jack took a step forward seemed to echo through the courthouse like thunder, each link of iron singing against the others in a metallic symphony that spoke of bondage and the possibility of freedom in equal measure. His movement was careful, deliberate, the walk of a man who understood that every gesture was being watched and judged, that his dignity was the only thing he truly owned in this moment, and he would not surrender it to the expectations of those who had already condemned him. Celia watched him approach with a mixture of fear and anticipation, her heart racing with the knowledge that she had just tied her fate to a man she didn't know, a man the town believed to be a killer, a man whose only recommendation was the something she had seen in his eyes that spoke of truth in a room full of lies. The judge's gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, the sharp crack of wood against wood that seemed to seal their fate with the finality of a coffin lid closing, the legal machinery grinding into motion to bind them together in a union that neither had chosen but both had accepted. In that moment, as the sound of the gavel faded into silence and the reality of what had just happened settled over the room like a shroud, Celia felt the first stirring of something that might have been hope, the dangerous possibility that her choice had been guided by something deeper than desperation, something that might yet prove to be the salvation of them both. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the jail's barred window as Celia sat beside Jack's cot, studying the red marks his chains had left on weathered wrists. The silence between them carried the weight of their impossible situation. Two strangers bound by a desperate choice, facing a town that wanted blood. Jack's eyes, when they met hers, held none of the violence the court had painted there, only a quiet resignation that made her chest tighten with unexpected recognition. "You didn't have to choose me," he said finally, his voice rough from a sleepless night. "There were safer men in that line." Celia traced patterns in the dirt floor with her finger, remembering the moment she'd pointed at him, how something in his bearing had called to her, a dignity that remained unbroken despite the accusations. The other prisoners had looked at her with hunger or calculation, but Jack had simply waited, as if he understood that choice itself was sometimes the only freedom left to the powerless. The sound of approaching boots made them both tense, and Sheriff Morrison appeared at the cell door with a ring of keys that jangled like wind chimes in a storm. "Time for the ceremony," he announced with barely concealed disgust, his pale eyes lingering on Celia with the kind of contempt reserved for those who dared to exist between worlds. "Judge wants this done quick and legal-like, before folks start asking too many questions about what passes for justice in this town." As Jack stood, the chains around his ankles scraped against stone with a sound that seemed to echo in Celia's bones. She watched him straighten his shoulders, transforming himself from prisoner to man with a subtle shift that spoke of inner strength the court had failed to break. The morning light caught the silver in his dark hair, and she found herself wondering what dreams had been stolen from him, what hopes had been buried beneath the weight of false accusations. They walked together toward the courthouse, their footsteps creating an odd rhythm, her soft moccasins against his heavy boots and dragging chains. The townspeople lined the street like vultures, their whispered comments following the strange procession with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Celia kept her chin raised, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear, even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. At the courthouse steps, Jack paused and looked down at her with something that might have been gratitude or sorrow. She couldn't tell which. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "know that you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." When she asked what that was, he smiled for the first time since she'd known him, an expression that transformed his entire face and made her understand why someone might have loved him once, before the world had turned cruel and taken everything away. The courthouse felt smaller in daylight, its rough-hewn walls pressing close as Judge Harwick shuffled through papers with the bored efficiency of a man conducting routine business. The same crowd that had jeered the day before now watched in hushed anticipation, their faces reflecting a mixture of entertainment and unease at witnessing something that felt both sacred and profane. Celia stood beside Jack, acutely aware of the space between them, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, far enough to maintain the pretense that this was merely a legal transaction. "Do you, Celia Moreno, take this man as your lawful husband, for better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do you part?" The judge's words carried no warmth, no acknowledgement of the gravity of what was being asked. Celia felt the weight of every eye in the room, the collective breath held in anticipation of her response. When she spoke her "I do," the words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, carrying implications neither she nor Jack fully understood. Jack's voice, when his turn came, carried a surprising steadiness that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. "I do," he said, looking directly at Celia rather than the judge, and something in his tone suggested he was making a promise that went beyond the legal requirements of their situation. The chains around his wrists clinked softly as he attempted to reach for her hand, a gesture both tender and heartbreaking in its futility. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you man and wife," Judge Harwick declared with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list. "You may kiss the bride, though I reckon those chains might make it interesting." The crude laughter that followed his comment made Celia's cheeks burn with shame and anger, but Jack simply stepped closer, his presence creating a small island of dignity in the sea of mockery surrounding them. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and brief, a whisper of connection that somehow managed to feel both completely artificial and startlingly real. Celia tasted dust and desperation on his lips, but also something else, something that spoke of honor and protection, and promises that had nothing to do with the legal document being prepared. When they separated, she saw her own confusion reflected in his dark eyes, along with a question neither of them was ready to ask. As they signed the marriage certificate with Jack's shackled hands and Celia's trembling fingers, the reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were married now, bound together by law and circumstance, two people who had chosen each other in desperation and must now figure out how to survive the consequences. The courthouse emptied around them, leaving them alone with their new reality and the uncertain promise of whatever came next. The small room above the general store that served as their temporary home felt like a cage disguised as sanctuary, its thin walls offering little protection from the curious whispers of the town below. Celia sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still wearing her simple brown dress, while Jack stood by the window with his back to her, finally free of his chains but somehow still carrying their invisible weight. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope, filled with all the things they didn't know how to say to each other. "I can sleep on the floor," Jack offered quietly, his voice carrying the careful politeness of a stranger trying not to intrude. The gesture touched something deep in Celia's chest. Here was a man who had been accused of murder, who had every reason to be bitter and angry, yet his first concern was for her comfort and dignity. She studied his profile in the lamplight, noting the way exhaustion had carved lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried burdens she couldn't begin to imagine. Outside, the sounds of Bitter Creek settling into evening drifted through the thin walls. Horses being led to stable, the distant laughter from the saloon, the creak of wagon wheels on dusty streets. It was the soundtrack of a world that had judged them both and found them wanting, a world that would be watching tomorrow to see how their strange union would unfold. Celia pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling suddenly small and uncertain in the face of everything that lay ahead. "Tell me about your ranch," she said finally, needing to fill the silence with something other than their shared uncertainty. Jack turned from the window, surprise flickering across his features, before settling into something that might have been gratitude. As he spoke of rolling hills and clear streams, of cattle and horses, and the simple satisfaction of working land that belonged to him, his voice took on a warmth that transformed him from accused criminal back into the man he had been before the world had turned against him. The story he told was one of dreams built slowly and carefully, of a life constructed from hope and hard work until a single moment of being in the wrong place at the wrong time had brought it all crashing down. Celia found herself leaning forward, drawn into his words, seeing in them echoes of her own longing for a place where she could belong without apology or explanation. When he finished speaking, the silence that followed felt different, less empty, more full of possibility. As the lamp burned low and the town grew quiet around them, they made their awkward arrangements for sleep, two strangers learning the careful dance of sharing space without sharing intimacy. But as Celia lay listening to Jack's steady breathing from his makeshift bed on the floor, she found herself thinking not of the desperate circumstances that had brought them together, but of the quiet strength she had heard in his voice when he spoke of home, and wondering if perhaps, against all odds, they might yet find a way to build something real from the ashes of their separate devastations.